Okay. Gonna have chat here. Okay, so that link should bring you here. All you need to do is click on that, download it. And once we actually, Steam, get out here. Once we actually start the workshop, you're just gonna open this file and it's gonna automatically import it into your Unity project. All right, so we have our Unity project open, and all you need to do is drag wherever you have your Unity package into the window. It'll bring up this, and all you're gonna wanna do is click import. All right, so once that finishes, you should have new folders in your assets with all the other stuff. All right, and I want to make it clear, if you have any new trouble doing any of this, please let me know. It really helps if you are just like, hey, something went wrong, and like then I can help you figure it out. Like the worst thing is just like checking back in and everyone's like, oh yeah, we stopped following along like 15 minutes ago. So again, if you have any problems, please let me know. I'd be happy to help you figure it out. All right, so I'm gonna assume everybody has their packages installed, and I'm gonna get started. Okay, so Unity is made up of a lot of these windows. So like all of these individual windows you can move around, and they hold different stuff. Probably one of the most important windows is called Scene. And this is where all your game objects and all the elements of your game are gonna be. It's kind of like just the space that you'll be putting your stuff. To navigate this, left click is to select things, right click is to pan while you're in here. And something else you can do with objects here is if you go into this top left corner, you can select a move tool. That's the 4 arrows in a cross pattern. And if you have something selected, like I do with the camera, you can move it around in world space. And you know you'll have something selected if it's highlighted here or that object is showing up on the right side. Yeah, you most likely have to have the latest version of Unity. Okay, so that's the scene window. Let's now talk about the hierarchy. So the hierarchy is just the list of everything that's in your scene. So right now, all it has is a camera and nothing else. So let's talk about what you're actually going to be putting in the hierarchy. If you right click on your hierarchy window and go down to create empty, it will create an empty game object. So what is a game object? A game object is, if you have programming experience, you can kind of relate it to the object class in Java. It's kind of what everything, it's kind of just like a really base class that you can add more stuff onto. If you don't have programming knowledge, then just think about it like the most basic object that you can make. Literally the only thing on a game object is a position, a rotation, and a scale. And rotation and scale don't really do anything if there's nothing else on the game object. So pretty much it's just an empty point wherever. And you can start adding stuff to it to make it more complex. Is there a shortcut to access the move tools? Let me see. M? I guess. Yeah, it looks like M. Okay, so that's a game object. You can see that I was kind of pointing here when I had the game object selected. This is the inspector window. The inspector window actually shows all the components attached to a certain game object. So for this game object, there's a transform, and that describes the position, rotation, and scale, as you can see there, in 3 dimensions. Game objects also all have a tag and layer, and those are used to kind of sort game objects, and we'll be talking about those later. Okay, so now that we're in this window, let's try actually adding a component. The first thing that we're going to add is a sprite render, and this will actually let us see our game object once we...
What's a component?
Oh, a component is something that you can attach to a game object. It holds, how do you describe a game object? Good question, Robert. Well, if you were thinking about it like a car, a component would just be one part of it. So, one component could be like the engine or the wheels or a seat. But a component pretty much just alters a single game object that it's attached to. All right, so we have a sprite render on this game object. Now let's actually put a sprite in there so we can see it. So let's go into Sunnyland, artwork, and just choose any of these. So we'll drag it from down here and put it into this selection right here. Kind of small, but that's what we'll use our transform for. We'll change the scale of it, wide scroll, and we can have a larger sprite. Okay, is everybody at this point with a game object with a sprite render on it?
Yeah, you can also choose a sprite by clicking on the circle on the right side of that part and just finding it through the directory as well.
Yep. I should probably bring this up too. Cool. I see a single thumbs up. 100%. Okay. All right, so now that we have a sprite render, let's try let's try playing the editor. Get out of the way. Okay, so when you push play on the editor, it's almost like it's running the game that you're building. And right now, since we don't really have anything, it's just a sprite. But hey, that means our sprite is in the right place. Our camera is looking at it. So yeah, that's what we wanted. Okay, so the next thing that we're gonna add to this game object is, oh, and I'll probably just rename it to player or whatever. So the next thing that we're gonna add is a rigid body. So a rigid body identifies a game object as a physics object. So now physics will be applied to it. One of the more important effects of this is that now it's going to be affected by gravity. So if we push play, oh, falling squirrel. Okay. So yeah, that's what a rigid body does. Pretty much just applies the physics to it. But that doesn't really mean anything if we don't have any other objects for the squirrel to collide in the scene. So let's go to a different scene where we can actually start to see some of that collision. So go into your assets folder, go into your scenes folder, and double click input. And it should bring you to a new scene. Is everybody okay with that?
We're using rigid body 2D, right? Just to make
Yes,
sure.
yes,
Okay.
2D. Because this is a 2D game.
It's fake 2D.
Yeah, that's something kind of interesting about Unity. Unity is inherently a 3D game engine. So for 2D, they kind of just put everything on 2 dimensions.
Push it all together.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to assume that everybody is in this scene now. And the first thing that you'll see is, hey, that squirrel's not standing on anything. That doesn't happen in real life, probably. So you're going to want to go into your environment thing here. And as you can see, you can parent some objects to other game objects. Right now, I'm just using it kind of as a organizational folder kind of thing. But we're going to talk a little bit about that later and what it actually means for the childhood game objects. Okay, so we're going to go into platform, first of all. And we're going to go into the sprite render. We're going to click on sorting layer. And right now, the only sorting layer that's here is default. So we're going to add a sorting layer.
Oh, what's a sprite renderer?
A sprite render is what gives a game object a sprite to be rendered by the camera. So it pretty much just attaches a sprite to a game object. So if I go back into, dang it. All right, adding a new sorting layer. Let's call this one ground. Right, so why we actually want to add a separate sorting layer is because if these two objects are on the same, the background and the platform, if they're on the same sorting layer, the game engine doesn't really know which one to render on top of each other. So it just randomly chooses it sometimes. And that's why some of you might have it above it already. If you want to really ensure that it never does that, you want to make a separate sorting layer for it to be on. Okay, so now that we have ground, let's go into the, get out of the way. So now that we have a ground, let's play the editor and see what's in the scene. Okay, so really basic movement right now. If you push A and D, you'll be able to go left and right. And that's pretty much all. But this box will collide with you. You're not falling through the floor. If you throw yourself off the edge, you'll just fall into oblivion. We're not worried about that. Okay. What we want to do is actually add a jump to that player controller so we can maybe jump over this crate or whatever else. So let's look at our player right now. You might have noticed that while we were moving around, the camera was following us. And that's because the camera is childed to the player. And to child something, you can just drag it in the hierarchy onto something else, and it will automatically child it. So when an object is childed to something else, it means that the child object, it means that any change to the transform that happens to the parent object also happens to the child object. So, for example, if I were to move the player object up, it would also move the camera. And same goes for rotation. Oh, that's, yeah, 3D game. Rotation like this. In game, the camera would also be rotated. Scale, same thing. Yeah. So that's really useful if you want multiple parts of a game object to all follow something else. Okay, so let's also look at the components that are on the player. So sprite render, yeah, that's why we see a squirrel. Rigid body, that's why it was falling and affected by physics. Box collider, that's something I didn't show you before. Game objects need a box collider to actually collide with other colliders. If I were to example, disable this component, and that's how you disable them, you just uncheck the box next to the name, and then play. So this is with no box collider. You go through everything else. So you do need a rigid body and a box collider to actually have something. Your fox is falling through the ground. Okay. Does it have a box collider? Okay, cool. All right, so we're just going to look at the player controller. So the way that we actually look at what this script does is you can click on these three dots over here and push edit script. I think double clicking it works too, or even you can right click on your project window. It's not letting me. You can do that, or you can even right click and say open C# project. Okay. Oh, I just realized this might not work if you don't have a Visual Studio on your computer, or if you don't have any IDE. If that is the case, you might not be interested in programming anyway.
It works on Notepad, but that's probably not the best to use.
It's not the best, but if you,
I would suggest using VS Code. It's a lot lighter than Visual Studio, so you can probably get it downloaded and working pretty quickly.
right, okay. Yeah, that's an option too.
But yeah, I would heavily recommend downloading some sort of text editor because like autocomplete and stuff like that is super helpful.
Yeah, okay. So if you don't have an IDE today, just make sure that if you're still interested in scripting after you see what we do today, you download either VS Code or Visual Studios, because those are very useful when you're scripting.
Or Writer.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so this is a very basic player controller. Let's go over the components of it. So if you don't have any programming knowledge, this might look kind of weird. And if that is the case, you honestly might just be able to ignore this part.
We still try to explain it though, right?
Yeah, of course. But for programmers, this is going to be your bread and butter. This is going to be what you're going to be working with for most scripts. So our player controller inherits from something called mono behavior. How do you open the player controller file again? So you can either go to the player, go to where the component is, click the three dots, and then push edit script. Another way you can do it is you can right click on your project window and say open C# project. And that's going to bring you to here. Or if it's just an empty page, you're going to have to go to the side, open assets, scripts, and double click this. All right. So what is mono behavior? The thing that player controller is inheriting from. Mono behavior is just what Unity uses to structure its scripts. And it's where a lot of the methods and classes that you'll see here come from. So like rigid body, that's in mono behavior. Start, that's in mono behavior. Okay. So let's talk about these variables first. Here you see that I have a reference to a rigid body 2D. And that's something important that kind of shows how components can be accessed in script. You can get references to individual components on a game object and then alter their values or behaviors. You'll also see that we have two public variables, speed and jump force. So usually you're not using public variables and then immediately sending them, right? That's kind of weird. But if you go back into the editor, click on player, and then go back to the player controller, you'll see, oh, hey, we can actually look at and change the values of those public variables. So I can make it speed 9, and if I go back into play mode, oh, okay, we good. Now he's moving slightly faster. Okay, let me just say 50. That's probably reasonable. Okay, yeah. So a public variable allows you to change values on scripts in editor.
Oh yeah, also if you change things in editor during play mode, it resets after you exit, so be sure like if you change anything important, you remember it.
Yeah, pretty much you just don't want to be changing public values while you're in play. It's much safer to do it when nothing's happening. Oh, also, let me just show you what the pause button does. So you're in play, you fall off a cliff. Oh, you can actually pause it. And this will halt any behaviors and just give you a snapshot of what is happening at that moment. In your game window up here, you can also look at how it looks in game. How do you get the background in the hierarchy panel again? Like how do I get this platform in front of the background? I'm not sure what you mean by get the background in the hierarchy panel. If you want to get to the background, I guess, you would expand this environment thing. You have an environment folder. Are you in the correct scene? Did you double click on input over here? Because if you're still in your empty scene or sample scene, there's not going to be the assets. Yeah, so yeah, just make sure that you're in the input scene. Okay. So, what was I talking about again? Right, the player controller. So that's what public variables do. Let's talk about the start function. The start function is called whenever a game object, the first frame a game object is active. So as soon as a game object appears on the screen, or like as soon as you push play, this function is called, and anything that's in it does whatever. So that's why we have our reference to a rigid body right here. As soon as the editor starts, we make sure that we get the reference to the rigid body that we want. Okay. Update is also a function derived from monobehavior. And update is called every single frame. So that makes it very useful for movement or moving objects around or timers, stuff like that. And we have a function in here that will handle movement. And that's what's letting us move from side to side. So let's talk about how we do movement. This is pretty much the most basic way you can do movement. And obviously there are better ways to do it, but this is just here for simplicity's sake. If you want a more complex system and probably more powerful system, you can look up some tutorials online of just a basic player controller, and you'll definitely find some pretty useful setups. Do we have to use vector 3 even though we are doing 2D? Not necessarily. I just do it because I honestly don't have a reason to do it either way. But I do just like making sure that, at least when I'm changing the position, I use a vector 3 to make sure that the z coordinate is always 0. Okay. Yeah, so awake is kind of like start. It just runs before start. There's an order to how these functions run, but I'm not completely sure about it. If you want to look it up, I'm sure you'll find something more definitive, but you'll just want to make sure that you know what the order is. Something small though is start will always run before the first call to update. So start is kind of like where you do all your setup. So if we change the z, will that move it behind other objects? Yes, because this is a change to your rigid body's velocity. So let me just give an example. If when going left, it gives you negative x velocity, it maintains your y velocity. But for some reason, it also makes you go, I don't know, like 1 speed in the z direction. Huh. Wait a minute. Man, I'm actually not sure why that's not working. Wait, my mic's muted?
No, I can hear you fine. But like sometimes you like fade out a little.
Oh, okay. Is it really bad?
I mean, it's not terrible.
Okay. All right. I'm just gonna try to talk louder. Maybe that'll help. I don't know. I think that's something that happens with Zoom. It's happened in previous workshops, but it only got bad a second ago. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's probably just because I was talking softly. Okay. I'm really not sure why that didn't change my Y position or my Z position. What the heck?
But you can still explain the concept without changing the code, right? Like you can just change the position, the Z position in the inspector, and then show how how the sprite can go in front of and behind other.
Yeah, I'm just kind of confused why it's not actually doing it. Oh, I think it's always rendering behind it. Yeah. Oh, that's something I should probably mention. So in your sprite render for sorting layer, if 2 objects do have the same layer, you can give them an order. So since the squirrel and the background are both on default, usually they would randomly choose between them 2. but since the squirrel has a higher order in the layer, it's always going to be rendered above it. So if you don't actually want to make another sorting layer, you can just do that. But usually it's a good idea to have some sorting layers because it's difficult to keep track of all your orders if you don't have a system. Okay, let's talk about making a jump. I'm gonna mostly try to have you guys do a jump by yourselves, but I'm going to explain the components of it. So input is a class, and when you use get key from it, you'll be able to check for input from a certain key. If you're not sure about the formatting, it's pretty much just this, and you can replace the letter with whatever key that you want to make jump. And for this, change to velocity. If you just think of a physics object, you're pretty much just, if you want it to go left, you're making its x speed negative, and you're just retaining its vertical velocity. Okay, so I'm gonna give you guys like 5-7 minutes to try to figure out how a jump would work. And in the meantime, I'm probably also going to be typing out some stuff. When I open the C# project, there's no code or anything in Visual Studio. Right, so that's probably because it doesn't have this selected. Does it look something like this? Okay, so if you look at your Solution Explorer over here, you can open your Assets folder, open your Scripts folder, and then double click on your player controller. If that's not there, I think it's a problem with Unity linking with Visual Studios, and that's a more complicated problem that I might have to go into after the workshop. But did that work for you? Okay, nice. Cool. All right, so I'm just gonna give you guys some time to try figuring out how a jump would work. And obviously, I don't really expect you guys to do it perfectly, and that's completely okay because, you know, this is an intro class. Just try making something, because usually you'll learn something from doing something wrong. Okay, so at about 6:48, I'll check back in with you guys.
Got some elevator music to play.
Oh yeah, let's find that.
Okay, Kahoot music.
True.
Yo, that's too distracting though.
Yeah, that's too fire, dude.
All right. Can you guys hear that?
It's like, yeah.
Okay, good.
Gotta go.
And while you're making that jump function, definitely feel free to ask some more questions in chat. I'll be answering them all. Hey, Karina, how were those bagels?
They turned out really good. I had one as a snack with some cream cheese.
Wow. Did you
It
top
was a
them?
good snack.
Did you top them with anything?
I did some with grated cheese and like a garlic onion powder.
Ooh,
And
that sounds good.
Yeah, and then some of them had like this Italian pepper seasoning thing that we have. But yeah.
Is there a function key to make the game run? I think so. having to let me see. Maybe not. Maybe like control space. No, that's not it. Nope, that's not it either. Yeah, I think you just have to click it. Sorry, man. Just let the elevator music relax you then. Sorry, Karina, what were you going to say?
I'm gonna see what the internet says. The interwebs.
If you had a smoked salmon, that'd be really good on a bagel.
Oh, you're right. We had salmon for lunch today, but it was like cooked salmon, not smoked. But that'd be so good on a bagel.
Yeah. Freaking salmon being cooked instead of smoked.
Oh, control P. Nice.
Oh, nice.
Have you cooked anything lately, Alex?
Let me think. I made fried rice.
Fried rice is always delicious.
Yeah, and I made it with some leftover shrimp.
Oh.
The weird thing was like, so I started cooking it and like I put in the shrimp. And before that, it just, it's just normal fried rice. But as soon as I put in the shrimp, oh yeah, there is a place to see compile errors. You go into console. It's right next to project. I have 2 project windows, but I think you guys will probably only have 1. And console will have all your, all your errors. Yeah, Chris, I see that. Yeah. Flying squirrel. So I'm actually going to explain how you can prevent having a flying squirrel. Okay, it's 48. It's 6:48. I'm going to go over a solution of how to make a pretty consistent jump. Double jumping squirrel. That's actually something we'll talk about later. So this workshop is blocked off for 6 to 8, but we'll probably finish before that. And most of the time afterwards is just for us to hang out and for you guys to ask more intricate questions like that, and for me to try to show you the best way to do that. Okay, so making a jump. There are a couple ways to do it. First, I'm going to show you the more simple solution. So I'm just going to make my jump key W. And I'm going to say, okay, I want your vertical speed as soon as you push the W key to be jump force. So I'm going to put that there. And I want your horizontal speed to be what it was before. I want it to maintain the same horizontal speed even after you click, after you press jump. So I'm going to access rigid body. I'm going to access the velocity field in rigid body, and I'm going to access the x component of the velocity vector 2. And that way, you'll have the same x velocity while jumping as you did when you were not. Okay, so let's see what this does. All right, move side to side, jump, okay, all right. And flying squirrel. So, obviously that's not really what we want. We want the player to be able to jump once, land, and then only be able to jump once they touch ground again. Okay, so how do we go about doing that? Well, right now, we don't have any check for if they're on the ground. So the really simple solution to this is to define a new variable called a private bool, and we'll say grounded. That's not how you spell grounded. Called grounded, and make that part of the conditional for a jump to activate. So now the player has to be pushing W, and grounded has to be true for the jump to happen. And obviously after a jump, we want grounded to be false. And we need to be setting grounded to true somewhere. So let's use something called onCollision enter. And this method will be called every single time your player object collides with another box collider. So if it's colliding with another box collider, let's just say that grounded is back to true. Oh, sorry, I should probably hold on that for a little, just in case anybody needs to copy it down. Why not just check if the velocity is greater than 0? That could work. One problem that might arise with that is if you have a slant going up, their velocity would be, and they're like walking up it, their velocity would be greater than 0, but then they wouldn't be able to jump on the slant. So there's a lot of different ways like that that might have a few problems, and we're going to go over a more complex solution that gets around many of these problems. Okay, so now that we improved that jump, let's say, okay, I'm holding down W and I am not flying, so that's already an improvement. A side effect of the way that we did it was now you can wall jump. So if that's not what you want in your game, you would probably have to do a different method of jumping. Oh no. Okay. And we're definitely gonna go over a method of jumping that will not have that problem. Another issue with this is if you run off an edge, you're gonna be able to jump because it doesn't actually check if there's ground below you or not. It just checks if you jumped last. And if you're just walking off, you'll still have that jump. Okay, so that's obviously not a perfect solution. Let's go over a better one. And it's obviously going to be a lot more complicated, but it's going to solve pretty much all the issues that we saw. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to right-click our player, create an empty, and we're going to rename it to ground check. And just to make it more convenient, we're going to click on this cube next to the name and select one of these. Okay, select one of these colors so that we can actually see it in editor. Okay, so now that we have our ground check, let's move it so that it's right about our player's feet. Okay, so now that it's at the player's feet, let's go back into our player controller. So we are going to add two more variables here. We're going to add a public layer mask, and we'll call it ground layers. And we're going to add a public game object, and we're going to call that ground check. All right, is everybody at this point? Or is everybody getting to this point? Okay.
Alex, Denzel asked, does ground check have to be the same?
Ground check have to be the same. Um,
Oh, like the same name.
No. When you're just making a variable name in your script, it can be anything you want, pretty much. It just helps to have something descriptive. And also, fate of reality. Grounded check stuff from before towards the bottom. Do you got it here? Because what we added before was this and this line. Okay. Yeah, so pretty much any variable name that you give, technically, it doesn't matter at all. Sometimes you'll get some overlap if you're bad with your naming. So the general naming convention that works is camel case, or I think it's called lower camel case. Sometimes they inject it. I'm not sure what that means. Same as the red. Is the size of the ground check object the same as the red visual? No. So the red object is literally just kind of a UI thing. It just helps you see it. And okay. Let me just explain this ground check thing first, and I'll go back to where I defined the new variables. So the ground check, okay, actually, it's probably more pertinent that I explain game object size. A game object doesn't really have a size until you actually add some components onto it. It does have a scale, but if there's nothing on the game object, it doesn't really matter. Transforms usually describe a single point. And like a point, it doesn't actually have any length, mass, volume, whatever. Okay, so the three variables that we just added are these three, or these two actually. And we're gonna be using them to make a better jump. Okay, so first of all, let's get rid of what we had before. We do still want to keep the and grounded for the jump. I've just worked with some frameworks where they automatically detect the names of entities or components, so it is added automatically. Right, yeah. It's Unity has its own quirks. Just a bunch of stuff to learn, but if you start with the really basic stuff, it's manageable. Okay, so far we should have these two variables. We should have deleted the on collision enter, and our jump function should look like this right now. Okay, so what we're going to do is now we're going to say grounded equals, and this is an update, so it's called every single frame. We're going to check if grounded is inside the ground layers. So a useful function to do that is physics 2D overlap, let's say circle, overlap circle. And in Visual Studios, you can hover over a method and check what parameters it wants. So it wants a point and a radius. So the point would be where our ground check is. And to get the position of game object, you do ground check. That's our game object dot transform. That gets the component that describes its position. And then from the transform, you would get its position. And then comma, what's our radius? Let's just go with like 0.3 or something. And when you're defining a float, make sure that you have the F behind it. And now, grounded will equal true whenever your ground check is overlapping with any of the layers that you define in your layer mask. Oh, we also need to add the layer mask. So ground layers. So now this position, this radius, these layers, if the position is in those layers, grounded is true, and then our jump behaves correctly. So now let's actually set those values, those public values that we just made. We'll go down to our player controller. It needs a game object, so we're gonna drag our ground check into there. And for ground layers, we should probably make a ground layer. So we'll go up to layer up here. We'll say add layer and ground. Then we'll go back to player and select ground here. What component was the ground check? So the ground check is its own game object, childed to the player. It's pretty much an empty game object. And what we're doing is we're storing a reference to a game object, not a component. So that's actually those are different things. A game object will hold components. A component is actually what goes on it. Does that make sense? And also, if you have any questions about how to actually get these variables assigned, please tell me. So how do you add it in? You can click, you're gonna wanna have your player selected so it's showing up in the inspector. And then you can just drag ground check into this box here. Or you can push this circle, it'll bring up this window, and you can find ground check here. Did that help? What is a layer mask and what is it used for in this situation? Okay, so a layer mask is something that describes certain layers. Wait, how did you make the ground check in the first place? I right click on the player. I say create empty. It will create an empty game object. And then if you want to have that tag just for convenience to see where it is, you can click on this cube and click any one of these. Make it blue, whatever. Okay, so a layer mask describes a certain selection of layers. So if I had a layer mask, I can make it, you know what, I'll go to the player component and show you an example. So this is a public layer mask, which means I can define a layer mask right here. And a layer mask would allow me to choose several of these layers and some other ones, and like not select other ones. So if I wanted a layer mask that covered default and ground, I would check those two. And in code, now I can say, all right, is this object, does this object have the layers inside this layer mask? Like, is this object in a layer that is inside this layer mask? And I would be able to check it with like these selections. Am I being clear about that? Because I could probably explain it again, just in case. It's just to hold information about certain layers. So in the script, you can make sure that you only check for objects in certain layers. Yes, exactly. That's actually what this method is doing. It's saying, okay, we have a reference to our ground check. We know what position it's in right now. Is it within 0.3 units of an object that is inside, that has a layer that is inside this layer mask? A little bit of a mouthful, but you know. So how do I add the ground check so that it references the player? Okay, so what is there an autocomplete thing in VS Code? I think so. I'm pretty sure there is. Oh wait, maybe not. Maybe not. Yeah, so if it doesn't, that's I can't actually remember. I think it does. I'm not completely sure though. All right, see you, David.
Hi, David.
All right, so how do I add the ground check so that it references the player? We're actually having the player controller reference a game object, and we're gonna put the ground check in there. So if you have these two variables here, you'll see that we're taking in a layer mask and we're taking in a game object. In editor, we can actually, first of all, create a layer mask, and what we want for that is only ground. And we can drag in ground check into the spot that we defined in the player controller. Okay, I really hope that's clear. So we've been talking about it for a while, but let's actually see how it performs. All right, so normal side to side. Oh, okay, I can't jump at all. Oh, right, it's because I didn't actually define, I didn't put anything on the ground layer. If I go to the platform and I change this layer to ground, hey, look at that. I can jump, I don't wall jump anymore, and I don't coyote jump. Right, so pretty much the complete package for the kind of jump that we wanted. Obviously a lot more complicated. Oh, I need to actually make sure yeah, so you really want to make sure you're not doing huge changes inside of play mode. Okay, so obviously this method was a lot more complicated than what we did before. No. But it's really just solving some of the problems that crop up with a more simple system. Obviously, these solutions are a little difficult to create and find on your own. And that's why there's Google and YouTube. Like, they're definitely the most useful tools when game developing. It's my primary source of information because you're never going to know everything. It's just really useful to have all that information